Hi there, and welcome to our home. We're slowly but surely coming out of lockdown, and some of you might have long hair, others might be rocking a nice lockdown cut like I am. Fortunately, my wife has practiced a bit to cut hair, but some of you might have had an opportunity to go to a hairdresser, since that's now allowable under level 3 of lockdown. And today I just want to chat with you a little bit about something that I've noticed is a real need, particularly at this time. It seems to me like a lot of people have just really become really overwhelmed, if I can put it that way, by what's going on in terms of work, and like a lot of people aren't really getting any rest. You know, God created us to be dependent representatives of himself, according to Genesis 1 and 2, and that's going to be the text that we're going to look at today. And we function best when we align ourselves with the nature that God gave us, how he created us, what he created us as, and the purpose for which he created us. And we see in Genesis 1, let me just maybe read the text and then go from there. In Genesis 1 verse 1, a verse that is really well known. Many parents, teach it to their children. Many of you might know it, even though you might not know much of the rest of the Bible. You might know this verse. It says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw that the light was good." And so the text goes on, and God starts creating. First, he takes the creation which he created, the heavens and the earth which he created, which is formless initially, and he forms it. He creates space in it, and then he fills it. So he first forms it and then he fills it. So he creates the heavens, he creates space, he creates atmosphere, he creates dry land and water, all kinds of different aspects, areas of creation that he forms. And then he starts filling them with sun, moon and stars, the space, filling the atmosphere with birds, filling the dry land with plants and animals, and the sea with fish, etc. And there's this repeated sort of refrain, and it was evening and it was morning the first day, and it was evening and it was morning the second day, the third, fourth, fifth, up to the sixth day. And then finally, on the seventh day, the pattern breaks, and it's a bit different. In Genesis 2 verse 2, it says, "By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." And just Genesis 1 verse 1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." We see a few powerful things. That first part of the verse, "In the beginning God," shows us something about God. It shows us that in the beginning there was nothing else except God, which means that God needs nothing else to exist. God exists, he's independent, he's not dependent on anything else. And it also shows us that everything else came from God. Because in the beginning there was just God, and then God created everything else. So everything else flows out of God. And what that tells us as human beings is that if in the beginning all you have is God, then you have enough. And as it was true for the beginning of everything, so it is true for every new beginning that we have. And many of us are experiencing all kinds of new beginnings these days, with life that's really changing. So every time you have a new experience, every time you have a new relationship, say you get married, if you have God, then you have enough, because everything else you need is found in God. every time you step into a new role, maybe you have a child, you become a parent, if at that beginning you have God, then you have enough, because everything you need is in God. Every time you step into a new job, if in the beginning of that new job you have God, then you have enough, because from the beginning God has been enough, because everything else comes from God and flows out of God. And I just want to encourage you with that. I just sense that some of you, because you're experiencing so many new things, so many new beginnings, you're afraid, you're sort of uncertain, you're worried, anxious, a bit stressed out. And what Genesis 1 verse 1 tells us is that if in the beginning we have God, then we have enough. And if you have God in your life and you've surrendered to God, then you don't have to fear new beginnings, because everything we need for a new beginning is found in God. That's just sort of an aside. That's not what I really want to share about. Then it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And it shows how God created on two levels. The heavens, and notice the plural there, not heaven, but heavens, plural, which includes the sky, space, where the sun, moon and stars are, but then also the heaven of heavens, the spiritual realm. So God created creation on two levels, the physical, material, visible level, and the spiritual, immaterial, invisible level. And all of creation, takes place in those two levels. And then we see that God said, let there be light, and there was light. And the interesting thing to notice here, and this is, you'll see as we go on with our discussion, why this is important. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Now, God doesn't need light. God can see in darkness. God could see long before light was there, long before there was anything to see, anything physical at least to see. God could see. So God doesn't need light. So you've got to ask yourself, why did God create the light? And the obvious answer is because we need light. We as creatures, animals, plants, but specifically us as humans, we need light. Why did God create the dry land? Not because he needs dry land, but because we need dry land. Why did he create the atmosphere? Not because he needs to breathe air, but because we need to breathe air. Why did he create the plants, with fruit that can be eaten? Not because he gets hungry, but because we get hungry, etc., etc. I think you get the idea. The point is that in the beginning, God tells us that God is independent and he existed before there was anything else and without anything else, because he doesn't need anything else. Where God is independent, we as human beings are dependent. We need light. We need air to breathe. We need fruit to eat. We need dry land to live on, etc., etc. So we are dependent creatures. The whole story of Genesis and how God creates, one of the things, obviously many things that it wants to convey to us, but one of the things it wants to convey to us is that we are dependent creatures. So in our nature, we are dependent creatures. And like I said, we live best and we flourish when we live in line with the nature that God has given us, how he has created us, what he has created us to be. But secondly, also for the purpose that he has created us. In Genesis 1 verse 26, it says, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea, etc. And then verse 27 says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase. And what we see here and throughout the rest of Genesis 1 and 2 is just the main purpose for which God created us is to represent him or reflect him, to be in his image, to be like him and to reflect him in that. And then there are 5 ways in which God called us to reflect him. He called us to reflect him and represent him by relating, He says, let us. The us there's a plurality, so that already implies relationship within God. And from the New Testament, we know that's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in relationship with each other. God is a relational God, and He created us to reflect Him by being relational beings. So we reflect Him or represent Him by relating, by reforming. What I mean by that, verse 1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then the earth is formless and empty, and God forms it. In other words, He takes what's already there and He forms it, and then He fills it. So in a sense, the rest of the creation week was not God creating out of nothing, but God reforming what's already there. And God called us to reflect Him by also taking what He created and reforming it. And that forms a big part of our work that we do. And we might talk about that in a next session. So we reflect or represent God by relating, by reforming. We also represent God by ruling. He said, He created man and said, in our image, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and everything else in creation. So God rules, and He called us to reflect Him, His nature, and represent Him by ruling as He would have ruled the creation. We also reflect or represent God by reproducing. He said, be fruitful and multiply, increase. God blessed Adam and Eve and said, increase in the earth. And then finally, we reflect or represent God by resting. And that's the part we read in Genesis 2 from verse 2, where on the seventh day God completed His work and He rested. And I want to just briefly today look at that dynamic between working and resting. Now, we have, I know I'm talking to an audience, mostly people from Johannesburg, but people from all over, in all kinds of other places. And we all have different relationships with work. Some of us have too little work, and we'd love to have more work. We'd love to, especially now under lockdown, many of us have maybe had to close our businesses or take unpaid leave or something like that. And we just wish we had more work. Some others of us, we have too much work. We might be, sort of in the internet industry or in marketing or something like that. And we just completely overwhelmed by the amount of work, extra work that we have. In general, as a rule, in cities, and particularly in a city like Johannesburg, we tend to overwork rather than underwork. People come to Johannesburg because there are lots of jobs here. People have always come to Johannesburg because there are lots of jobs and because there's money to be made here. I mean, right at the beginning, Johannesburg started with the gold rush. That's why it's called the City of Gold. And people came here with the gold rush to make money. So making money is a big issue in Joburg, and it's sort of one of the richest cities in South Africa and Africa, and people come here to work and to make money. So it's a very industrious city, and many people in Johannesburg tend to overwork. But there's a bit of a tension there as well. So some of us feel we'd like to have more work. Other people, others of us, we'd like to have less work. And there's a bit of a tension between our working and our resting, because when we don't work, we feel restless. And when we do work, we need to rest from the work that we have. And there's this bit of a tension between the working and the resting. And to complicate matters, this modern era that we live in has sort of, I almost want to say, exacerbated or worsened that tension between the work and the rest, and the fact that we need a balance between them. I mean, if you look at, it's interesting, Genesis 1 over and over again, in a very subtle way, tells us that there should be a rhythm of work and rest, and it's something that we stick to even as modern people, and we don't often think of the fact that it comes from the Bible, but it says, and it was evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day. And there's evening when it's dark for us, a time for us to rest, and there's morning, when it's light, a time for us to work. And we see in that constant rhythm of evening and morning, of darkness and light, the rhythm of resting, sleeping, and rising and working. There's that constant rhythm. But not only is there that daily rhythm between day and night, resting, sleeping, and working, but there's also the weekly rhythm. The first 6 days God works, and then on the 7th day God rests. And we sort of model our 7-day week, even now, thousands of years later, on what God did right at the beginning with creation, when He worked and rested. And there's a rhythm not only of daily resting and working, but of weekly, days of work and then a day of rest. And there's a balance, in other words, that's needed. With that rhythm, it tells us that there's a balance that we need between work and rest. And it's one of those balances that we really struggle to maintain, especially as modern people. And there are a few reasons why, as modern people, we particularly struggle to do this. I was recently listening to a sermon by Tim Keller, and he mentioned a few of them. He said, for instance, that job security is at an all-time low. I mean, gone are the days, a few decades ago, when someone would start, in their early 20s in a certain job, or in their late teens even in a certain job, and then for the rest of their lives until they retire, they'd stay in that one job with that one company. I mean, it hardly ever happens anymore. But more than that, our times have become so performance driven, that when a department or a division or something underperforms, they just cut people, companies just cut jobs, because performance and making profit is such a big thing. So job security is at an all-time low. I don't think we've ever had so little job security, which means you constantly have to work, to keep your job or to get a new job. Secondly, the income disparities are tremendous, and I think we feel it in South Africa probably more than in any other country in the world, where the income ratio between people at the bottom of a company and people at the top of a company used to be sort of 10 or 20. The people at the top would earn 10 or 20 times more than the people at the bottom. Nowadays, the people at the top earn 100 to 200 times what the people at the bottom earn. In other words, the gap between rich and poor, between the top and the bottom, have become massive, which means the people at the top have to work. I mean, it's just expected, because they earn such massive salaries, it's just expected that they work, incredible hours every week. And if they're not willing to do that, they are, like many people, just queuing up, behind them to take over from them and do that work. But it also means, because the people at the bottom, the rich have become richer, but the poor have become poorer, and people at the bottom have to often work multiple jobs just to make ends meet, just to get by. So everyone's, working more. Then there's the whole issue of technology, and technology is an accelerator. It increases, it accelerates what's going on. For instance, our smartphones, our tablets and stuff. Basically, we have computers in our pockets, so we can receive not only phone calls, but text messages, WhatsApps, emails. We can have conference calls, you name it, all kinds of productivity software, Asana and Trello and all that kind of stuff, to help us be more productive. And what technology, what that means, the portable technology that we have, and the way through the fourth industrial revolution that we're integrating it into our lives, means that we can work anywhere, which means that we end up working everywhere. And I think with the lockdown and so many people working from home, that has just been aggravated, even more, because a friend of mine was telling me, he's working so much harder because, two of his bosses that he works with his sort of superiors that he reports to, they used to drive like maybe an hour and a half each, to work and back. And now because they're working from home, they have that extra hour and a half to think up new jobs and new kinds of work for him. And he's feeling it, he's just got a lot more on his plate. And, some people like, singles or young marrieds without children, they can sort of handle the work, but with the lockdown, people with children, it's not only the work that they have to handle, they now have to homeschool their kids. Okay, kids are slowly but surely starting to go back to school, but they had to homeschool their kids for the last couple of months, and they had to keep their own homes clean. They didn't have someone coming in to clean their home, so now you have to juggle those three balls. You're trying to keep the house clean, and I mean, most of us have forgotten how much work that is. It's quite a lot of work, get all the dishes washed, the clothing washed, everything clean and swept, and the beds made and everything. Doing that homework that you might have outsourced to someone else or delegated to someone else. Then you have to do the schooling, which you used to just go and drop your kids off at school, but now you have to watch videos with them, make sure they do their homework, and especially if they're younger kids, they need some help with that. So now you're a teacher all of a sudden as well, and then somewhere in between there, you still have to try and be productive and get your day job done. So many people's managers, are like in the day they're like busy cleaning house, looking after the kids, and then all of a sudden in the afternoon or in the evenings, when usually you'll go home, then they start being productive and they start doing work. Oh, I didn't get everything I need to do done. So all of a sudden you've been working all day, and then you start getting, in the afternoon or early evening, you start getting these emails from your boss because now he's starting to work because, finally the kids are, all, bathed and showered and in their pajamas and ready for bed, and now he's starting to work and he's starting to delegate and send you emails and messages and asking you to get things done. And what I found is so many people are just really struggling because those lines, because of technology and because we've been working from home the last while, we're just working all the time, and the natural boundaries between working, our work life and the rest of our lives have been completely blurred, and so many people are just working so much harder than before and resting so much less, and are just on the verge of burnout and being completely overwhelmed. And if you're feeling like that, I just want to say that's normal. I think a lot of people are feeling that way. And I think a lot of us are struggling to deal with this new environment that we're in because of the lockdown and because of just our use of technology has just escalated. It's just, increased by orders of magnitude because of the lockdown and because we've had to use technology. And I mean, praise God for technology. It's so useful that we can actually still have meetings on Zoom or Google Meet or whatever. But the drawback is we if we're not careful, we end up working all the time, just not stopping. We're just working so we're working from home, so we just work all the time. You catch yourself and it's 8, 9, 10 o'clock and you're still working. And I know many of you can relate to this. You've been doing that for the last couple of weeks, and you feel just too thinly spread, like butter on too much bread. And if you're feeling like that, I just want to say there are a lot of people who are feeling like that, because all of us are struggling a bit to get that work rest balance right under this new normal that we're operating in. So modern sort of circumstances and trends, and especially the lockdown and technology and that kind of stuff, are exacerbating our imbalance between work and rest. But not only that, one of my favorite movies is a movie called Chariots of Fire, quite an old British movie, but it tells the story of Eric Liddell, a very committed Scottish athlete. He's a Christian, a very committed Scottish Christian, but he's also a very gifted athlete. And another gifted athlete called Harold Abrahams, who was a Jew, and Eric Liddell ran for the glory of God, and he did everything to glorify God. That was he felt his purpose in life. So he understood this whole thing about representing God or reflecting God and thereby glorifying Him. Whereas Harold Abrahams, his purpose in life was to sort of represent Jews who were marginalized and persecuted and so on. And it's interesting to see the difference between the two. Whereas Eric Liddell sort of had a settled sense of identity and security in who he was because of whose he was. He knew, I'm a Christian, I'm a child of God because I belong to God. I don't have to prove myself. So when he found out that he made the finals of I think it was the mile or something that he was running, and he was the clear favorite. He was going to definitely win it. But when he heard that the final was being run on a Sunday, because he wanted to honor God and as a witness to God and to his commitment to God, he decided not to run. And just because he was settled in his identity in God as well, so he didn't feel he had to prove himself by winning this to mean anything. In stark contrast to that, Harold Abrahams, he ran the 100 meters, also a very gifted athlete. He ran the 100 meters, and when they asked him, why do you work so hard? Why do you train so hard? To run the 100 meters, the sprint in the Olympics, and he said, when that gun fires, when that shot goes off, I have 10 seconds to justify my existence. And that highlights a different problem, and Keller also mentions this as sort of another trend. Whereas before we tended to find our identity, our sense of identity, our sense of belonging, our sense of who we are in our role in life, either as a mother or father or child, or as part of our family, and we used to work in the family business and so on. Nowadays, people have so much freedom to do whatever they want to and to sort of reinvent themselves, and your work sort of determines who you are, and we tend to find our identity not in representing God per se, but in working, in what we do, and Harold Abrahams was an example of that. When that shot fires, I have 10 seconds to justify my existence. And so many of us feel that way about our work. So the problem is not only the work and the balance between work and rest. The problem is that even when we do rest, we can't really switch off because we feel we need to prove ourselves, and that doesn't go away. No matter how hard we work, we always feel like it's not good enough if we have that same attitude that Harold Abrahams has. I need to prove myself through my work. It's never enough. And once you have proven yourself, then there's just another phase in which you have to prove yourself again and again and again. And there's what Keller calls the work underneath the work that you have to do, constantly doing. And that means that even when we do rest, it's not deep rest. It's like, he says it's like sleep. Scientists have found that it's not enough just to sleep. You have to experience deep sleep, REM, rapid eye movement sleep. And he says that when you have that sense, when you find your sense of identity and worth in your work, you cannot properly rest. You cannot descend into REM sleep kind of rest, even when you do stop. And so here's the assumption we make. We assume that we can rest simply by stopping our work. But the reality is we can't. It takes more than just stopping your work in order to really rest and find rest and really relax and recharge. And this Genesis 1 and 2 actually shows us that. It actually gives us a clue to how we can, a pointer towards the good news of how we can actually rest, not just in a balanced way, evening and morning, sleep and work, every seventh day take a day off and rest, but how we can have that deep rest of not only resting from our work, but resting from trying to prove ourselves, resting from resting in God's complete work. If you look at Genesis 1 and 2, it tells us two things about God's work. Firstly, it tells us that God's work is good because, God said, let there be light, and there was light, and then it says, and God saw that the light was good. And then he says, let there be, fish or animals or whatever, and he saw that it was good. And it's like, God's work in terms of its quality is good. So when God finishes something, he sort of sits back and he enjoys it, and he says, that's good. And when the quality of work is sufficient, you can sort of rest in it. You can sort of celebrate it and say, wow, that's good. But not only that, it says in chapter 2, it says on the seventh day when God had finished the work that he was doing, when he completed the work, God didn't rest because he was tired. An almighty being with endless power and energy never gets tired. God doesn't get tired. He doesn't need to sleep. He doesn't need to rest. He doesn't need to rest because he's tired. And God rested not because he was tired, but because he was finished. So not only was the quality of his work so good that he could enjoy it, but the quantity, he finished it. Everything that he needed to do, he finished doing. And he rested in that. And we can rest. We need to rest in work that's complete. Now, our work will never be complete, but we can rest in God's complete work. And as we know from the New Testament perspective, the ultimate finished work is the work of the cross, where Jesus hung on the cross and said, it is finished. It is done. That's the ultimate complete work that we can rest in. And it's a good work. We can sort of sit back and say, well, what Jesus did is good enough. It's finished. It's complete. It's done. I can rest in that. I don't have to prove myself anymore because of what Jesus did, because he completed the work I never could. I can now be accepted. I can now rest. I don't have to prove myself anymore because my acceptance depends not on what I do, but on what Jesus has done for me. And there's this line, I think it's in one of Tolkien's books. Some of you might have seen the movies, the Lord of the Rings movies. The Two Towers, the second book. There's this character, one of my favorite characters in the books, called Faramir, and he says, "Praise from the praiseworthy is above all rewards." And what he's saying is, when you get praise from someone who's praiseworthy, when you get acceptance from someone that you respect, that you look up to, that means more than anything. And so God's acceptance should be more to us than anyone else's. I mean, he's the only one whose acceptance really matters. And because Jesus said it is finished, the work is finished, we can be accepted. We are good enough, we're acceptable, and we don't have to work anymore. We don't have to labor, we don't have to strive anymore. If you contrast what Jesus said, his last words was, it is finished. The Buddha's last words was, keep striving. And unless you can rest in God's complete work, his good work, you'll never be able to rest. Now just consider this, Watchman Nee in his book Sit, Walk, Stand, which is a sort of a commentary on the book of Ephesians. He refers back to Genesis 1 and he says, 1 and 2, and he says, notice that the day of rest, when God had completed the work of creation, created everything, finished it and finished it well, it was very good. That day of rest, when God rested, was the seventh day for God, but the first day for Adam, because mankind, Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day, at the end of the sixth day. So the seventh day, the day of rest, was the first day for Adam and Eve. So the very first thing that Adam and Eve experienced was to rest in what God had completed and the good work that he had completed, the very good work that he had completed. And so God created us, and this is what Genesis 1 and 2 is telling us. God created us to work out of a place of rest, but specifically out of resting in God's completed work. So we first rest in God. We sit in that place of rest in God. And then from that we can then work. Not in order to prove ourselves like Harold Abrahams, but in order to represent God, reflect God, glorify God like Eric Little. I didn't get this balance right in my during my studies and so on, and I do this work-rest balance, and I went through stages of sort of passivity and procrastination, and then got into a workaholic frenzy. Worked through the night for 3-4 days, on tasks, to meet deadlines on projects and stuff, and then I was like so dead tired that I couldn't do anything again for a couple of days, and I know so many of you struggle with that as well, and we work best when we have that balance of evening and morning, sleep and work, but then also that weekly rest, that weekly cycle of 6 days of working and then 1 day of rest. Now, just in closing, 1 or 2 practical things that we can do. How can we rest? We need discontinuity. We need to stop the normal things we're doing and do something different. You cannot, if you cannot rest by doing the same things that you do when you work. And also we need to recognize, just like God created the heavens and the earth, the material and the immaterial, the physical and the spiritual, so God created us. Our bodies from the dust of the earth, physical, but then breathed into us the breath of life, spiritual. And to rest, we need something of both. You need to rest physically, but also and be sustained physically, but you also need to be sustained spiritually. That's the one thing. You need discontinuity, do something different. But then you also need, rest is a form of discovery. They had the Sabbath, not only the Saturday Sabbath, but they had Sabbath years. 6 years they'd plant on a certain plot of land, and then on the 7th year, they'd sort of stop and plant nothing, or and just let whatever was growing, the weeds or whatever, just come up. And sometimes you just need a time of rest where, whatever thought pops into your head can just come up and you can just sort of follow it, and just discover new things. Not have deadlines, not have something that you have to focus on or something that you have to do, but just follow whatever thought comes into your mind. Rest is also imitation. God rested and we imitate him. So representing him and reflecting him, part of how we do that is by resting. Resting is also an act of humility, where we admit that we are dependent creatures and we cannot work all the time. God can work all the time, but we can't. We need rest. And also, we acknowledge that, by resting, that I'm not the general manager of the universe. God is. And when I rest, I'm acknowledging that God can maintain and preserve his creation without my help and without my contribution. My contribution is not necessary. God gives me the opportunity to give it, but it's not necessary. And there's a humility in resting, where I acknowledge. It's an act of humility. We acknowledge that life can go on without me. God can manage the universe without me. Rest is also an act of trust, where I'm saying, I'm going to take this time and rest and trust God that he will preserve. I'm going to rest in God's preserving and God's complete work. I'm going to rest in that God has already done everything, and I'm going to rest in the fact that God maintains things even when, and blesses things, even when blesses. Let me put it this way: when you work hard for 6 days, but you say, I'm going to put those boundaries down. I'm going to rest 1 day a week. I'm going to have certain boundaries within which I work. Other people might go over those boundaries and work longer hours than you, but you trust God that he's going to bless the work that you do within the time that he has allocated for work, and actually make it more productive and more fruitful than the longer hours that other people work. And I've heard so many testimonies of people who've done that. Mezen was sharing with us the other day how she was working as a medical rep, and she worked less hours because she just had less time, but she prayed and she trusted God, and her numbers were just so much better. Her performance was just so much better than all the other reps because she just trusted God in that. And rest is an act of trust. And then finally, rest is an act of celebration. It's an act of celebrating that what God has done is enough. What God has done is good enough. And we can celebrate that by resting in it and saying, I'm good enough because what God has done for me is good enough. I don't have to prove myself. I don't have to justify my existence. I can rest deeply. And that is my prayer for you and for all of us, that we as Christians will be a counterculture that shows the world how we can actually rest. Not only rest from our work, but rest in God and in God's work that He did for us. Let me pray for us. Father, we just want to thank you, Lord, that we can work, and by working, reflect your image, represent you, but also rest, and by resting, trust in you, celebrate what you have done, and show the world that what you have done is enough. And we just pray, Lord, that Lord, during this time of disruption with the lockdown and COVID-19 and working from home and homeschooling and all those crazy things that make life so complicated and difficult for us, that you will help us to really rest. And Lord, give us the wisdom to lay down certain boundaries, Lord, even when it's difficult, to lay down certain boundaries, to make our work sustainable. And like Eric Little, to do it in a way that glorifies you, even if it costs us something, even if we have to make a few hard sacrifices. I just pray your blessing over all your people in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you.